Last summer, I stuck a voltmeter into a patch of dirt in my garden. No wires, no batteries, just soil. And the needle moved. 1 full volt of electricity, coming straight out of the ground. I had to check it twice. I thought the meter was broken. It wasn't. Welcome back to Rooted in Grace. I am so glad you're here with me today. Because what we are about to talk about is something that, honestly, I wish someone had told me 30 years ago. Most of us were taught that soil is just dirt, dead stuff. Something you have to constantly feed with bags of fertilizer, dose with chemicals, and drown with the garden hose just to get a decent tomato. I believed that for most of my life. But what if the ground beneath your feet is not dead at all? What if it is actually alive, breathing, working, and, yes, generating its own electricity? Today, I'm going to show you a secret that has been quietly buried for over 100 years. By simply putting a piece of old wood, a handful of crushed charcoal, and a scrap of copper into the same hole, you can build a garden bed that waters itself, feeds itself, and generates its own continuous electrical energy. No batteries, no power cords, no expensive trips to the garden center. This is a system you build once, and it runs quietly for years, pulling life out of the very air and earth around it. We are going to travel today from the ancient Amazon rainforest to the mountains of Germany and into the workshop of a 19th century clockmaker. We are going to connect 4 forgotten pieces of wisdom that, once you see how they fit together, you will never look at a garden the same way again. So, pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle into your chair, and let us dig into the electric soil secret. Part 1. The Wisdom of the Wood. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how, in a forest, nobody waters the trees? Nobody fertilizes them. Nobody sprays them with anything. And yet, the forest floor is the richest, most alive soil on the planet. Ever wonder why? It starts with something incredibly humble. A dead log. Not an expensive piece of lumber, just an old branch, a fallen fence post, maybe a chunk of firewood you never got around to burning. For centuries, and I mean centuries, farmers across Central and Eastern Europe have practiced a technique called Hugelkulture. It is a German word that simply means mound culture. The method is beautifully simple. You dig a trench, lay down large decaying logs, pile branches and leaves on top, cover the whole thing with soil, and plant right into it. Now, why on earth would our grandparents bury perfectly good wood? Because they watched nature. They paid attention. And here is what they figured out. As buried wood begins to decompose, it acts like a massive underground sponge. A single buried log can hold several times its own weight in moisture. During the heavy spring rains, the wood soaks it all up. Then, during those scorching dry days of July and August, that stored water slowly wicks back out into the surrounding soil, keeping your plant roots perfectly hydrated, without you ever touching a watering can. And here is the part that most people never hear about. Experienced gardeners who build these Hugelkulture mounds report that by the second year, listen to this, they rarely, if ever, need to water their gardens. Imagine that. A garden that waters itself. But water storage is only the beginning. As the wood breaks down, billions of microorganisms go to work. Fungi move in and colonize the logs, sending delicate white threads called mycelium through the grain, building a vast underground network. And this decomposition process generates real, measurable heat. The temperature inside a Hugelkulture bed can run several degrees warmer than the ground around it. For us gardeners, that means one very practical thing. The soil warms up earlier in spring and stays warm longer into autumn. You just extended your growing season for free. But here is where it gets truly strange. And this is the part that changed everything for me. In 2024, researchers at Northwestern University proved that the very bacteria breaking down this organic material actually release loose electrons, raw electrical charge, directly into the soil. The ground around a decomposing log is, quite literally, a living biological battery. Now, hold that thought. Because when you hear what the ancient Amazonians discovered 5,000 years ago, you will see exactly where this is going. Part 2. The Black Gold of the Amazon. Have you ever tried growing anything in sandy, worn-out soil? You know the kind. You add fertilizer in March, and by June, the rain has washed every bit of it away. It is like pouring money into a bucket with holes in the bottom. Well, imagine that problem, but 1,000 times worse. That is the Amazon rainforest. If you know anything about tropical jungles, you know the natural soil there is famously thin, acidic, and nutrient-poor. The relentless heat and rain strip organic matter so fast that real farming is nearly impossible. And yet, hidden deep in the Amazon, scientists discovered patches of soil so rich, so incredibly dark, that it looks like someone dyed it with ink. The locals call it Terra Preta de Indio, the dark earth of the Indians. These pockets of soil are up to 6 feet deep. And here is the remarkable thing. They have been producing abundant harvests for over 2,000 years, without a single drop of synthetic fertilizer. 2,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. For decades, modern scientists were completely stumped. How did it get there? Who made it? Eventually, archaeologists figured it out. Ancient indigenous peoples engineered this soil on purpose. They took wood, heated it in low-oxygen pits to drive off the volatile oils, and created a stable, porous, carbon-rich material that we now call biochar. They crushed this charcoal, mixed it with food waste and broken pottery, and worked it into the earth generation after generation. Now, here is a fact that is going to change how you look at a simple piece of charcoal forever. I want you to picture this. Under a microscope, biochar looks like a honeycomb. Millions of tiny tunnels and chambers. If you could somehow unfold all the internal surfaces of a single gram of biochar and lay them flat, they would cover up to 9,000 square feet. That is more floor space than most houses. All of it inside a piece of charcoal the size of a pea. I know. I had to read that number twice myself. Those billions of microscopic pores create permanent housing for beneficial soil bacteria and fungi. Think of it as building a city for the invisible workers that keep your soil alive. But here is the part that connects everything. Biochar carries a strong negative electrical surface charge. It works like a magnet for positively charged nutrient particles. Calcium, potassium, magnesium, ammonium, all the things your plants are hungry for. Instead of letting the rain wash your nutrients away, remember that bucket with holes? The biochar catches them and holds them right in the root zone, right where your plants can reach them. And one more thing. Adding biochar to your soil dramatically increases its electrical conductivity. You are not just adding a sponge for water and nutrients. You are upgrading the soil itself into a conductive electrical medium. This ancient Amazonian charcoal is the bridge between the biological power of the German wood mounds and our next great discovery. And friends, this next part, this is where it all comes together. Part 3. The Earth Battery and the Spark of Life. Now, I need to tell you about a Scottish clockmaker, because what he did in 1841 sounds like something out of a storybook. His name was Alexander Bain. He took a plate of zinc and a plate of copper, buried them about a yard apart in damp soil, and connected them with a simple wire. That is it. No chemicals, no complicated machinery. The damp, mineral-rich earth acted as a natural electrolyte. It created a chemical reaction that produced a steady, direct current, about 1 volt. And Bain used this free, continuous current, drawn straight from the earth, to power the world's very first electric clock. It ran for months. Free electricity from dirt in 1841. Now, here is where it gets really interesting for us gardeners. Decades later, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, observant farmers and clever inventors started noticing something peculiar. Plants growing near these natural electrical currents were darker, thicker, and taller than the ones nearby. A French agronomist named Justin Christofleau took this and ran with it. He invented devices using copper wires to harvest atmospheric electricity and channel it into the soil. And he documented massive increases in crop yields, towering vegetables and vineyards that resisted diseases naturally. Now, why do plants love this gentle electrical current? This is the part nobody talks about. Science calls it electrotropism. When you bury a piece of copper and a piece of zinc in the soil, you create a tiny, localized galvanic cell. Your plant roots will actually grow toward the copper, seeking out the most nutrient-dense, electrically active zone in the bed. The roots know. They can feel it. Meanwhile, the zinc slowly corrodes and releases zinc ions into the soil, and your plants desperately need zinc. It is the building block for tryptophan, which is the precursor to auxin, the master growth hormone that drives fruit development and strong, healthy stems. But wait. Remember those bacteria we talked about? The ones digesting the wood in Part 1. There is a specific species called Geobacter. And what these microbes do is almost unbelievable. When Geobacter bacteria consume sugars released by plant roots, they actually grow microscopic electrical cables out of their own bodies, nanowires, and plug themselves directly into conductive surfaces to dump their excess electrons. Think about that for a moment. Tiny living things, building their own power grid in your soil. By providing copper, zinc, and highly conductive biochar, you are giving these tireless, invisible workers a superhighway to deliver energy and nutrition directly to the roots of your garden. And that, my friends, brings us to the moment we have been building toward. Part 4. The Electric Soil Secret. Putting it all together. All right. Now we have 3 separate miracles on the table. The water-storing, heat-generating wood of Hugelkulture, the permanent, nutrient-magnetizing charcoal of Terra Preta, and the growth-stimulating, hormone-producing galvanic current of copper and zinc. Separately, each one is impressive. But here is the secret, and this is the real heart of today's video. They are not just compatible, they are synergistic. Each one makes the other 2 work exponentially better. You put them together, and something extraordinary happens. So let me walk you through it. Imagine stepping into your backyard this weekend and building a living machine. You start by digging a shallow trench and laying down your untreated logs and branches. This is your water reservoir and your microbial fuel cell. Next, you add a thick layer of crushed hardwood charcoal, the kind you can make yourself or buy as natural lump charcoal. Soak it first in rich compost tea if you have some. This biochar is your nutrient magnet and your permanent electrical conductor. Then you cover it all with good topsoil. And finally, you press a simple copper pipe and a galvanized zinc nail into the dirt about 8 to 12 inches apart, near where your plants will go. That is it. That is the whole system. Now, here is what happens beneath the surface, and this is the beautiful part. The wood decomposes, feeding organic carbon to the microbes. The microbes eat the carbon and release electricity. The biochar catches the released nutrients and conducts the electrical charge. The copper and zinc create the galvanic current, pushing those trapped nutrients directly into the plant roots. As the seasons pass, the wood continues to release stored rainwater during droughts. Heat radiates upward from the rotting logs, warming the soil. And the biochar, here is the remarkable thing. It refuses to break down. It provides a permanent home for thriving biology,
Not for years, but for centuries. Nothing leaves the system. It just compounds, growing richer, deeper, and more fertile with every passing year. Completely independent of synthetic fertilizers, a closed loop. Built once, working forever.
Part 5. A lesson for the present.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You might be asking, if this is so effective, if it really works this well, why was I never taught this? Why are all the farms not run this way? And that, friends, is a fair question. The answer is not some grand conspiracy. It is simply economics. In the early 1900s, right around the time electroculture and earth batteries were showing real promise, two chemists named Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch cracked the industrial process for manufacturing synthetic nitrogen. Suddenly, giant chemical companies realized they could sell fertilizer in a bag. Now think about it. A system like the electric soil bed, built once from free branches, scrap copper, and homemade charcoal, has no recurring cost. You build it, and it feeds your family for a decade or more. There is no second purchase. There is no subscription. An industry built on selling chemicals year after year simply could not make money from a permanent, self-sustaining solution. So the funding shifted. The research was shelved. The wisdom of the Amazonians and the alpine farmers was dismissed as old-fashioned. But nature does not forget, and neither do we. There is a lesson here that goes beyond gardening. For decades, we have been told we must force the earth to produce, with harsh chemicals, endless watering, constant buying. But the truth is, the earth was designed with a magnificent, interconnected intelligence. By going back to these forgotten methods, we stop fighting the soil. We start cooperating with it. Every handful of biochar you bury is atmospheric carbon permanently locked away, cleaning the air for your grandchildren. Every log you bury saves water. Every copper wire you place is a quiet act of restoration. You are building a garden that heals the earth, not one that depletes it. So here is my invitation to you. You do not need a farm. You do not need expensive equipment. Start with a single raised bed, Or even a large pot on your patio. Find a fallen branch. Crush some natural lump charcoal. Grab a copper wire and a galvanized nail from the garage. Plant a tomato, a pepper, or a simple peace lily. And then, just watch. Watch how it thrives. Watch how it resists pests. Watch how it seems to glow with a vitality you have not seen before. And when your neighbors lean over the fence, marveling at your plants, and ask what expensive miracle fertilizer you are using, you can just smile and tell them you are using the oldest secret on earth: wood, copper, and the quiet, infinite energy of creation. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on Rooted in Grace. If this opened your eyes the way it opened mine, share it with a friend who loves their garden. And leave me a comment. I would love to hear what you are going to try first. May your hands be joyful in the dirt. May your gardens grow strong. And may you always find peace in the simple, profound miracles of nature. Until next time, God bless you and happy growing.